All right, well, hey, everybody, and welcome back to Theology Thursday. My name's Alex. His name's Doug. It's great to be back with you guys again today. And Doug, we've got a kind of interesting topic here this afternoon that we're going to discuss. So obviously, nice. Bob Marley, huh? Go ahead. You can play that in the background. So coming up, obviously, there's an important question that's being asked specifically here in New Jersey as well about the legalization of marijuana. And there are a lot of questions that are kind of coming forward, like, hey, as Christians, how should we kind of think of this? And so, Doug, you thought it'd be a good idea if we sat down today and just talked about some of the biblical and doctrinal implications for how Christians should really think about marijuana in general, both, medicinal uses and recreational uses and everything else like that. We'll dive into some of those topics here today. Obviously, Doug, you mentioned this before when we were chatting. We're not trying to persuade anyone in voting one way or another. This is a non-political conversation. It's really doctrinally and biblically, how do we look at the usage of marijuana? And so, Doug, with that, does that sum up well what we're going to dive into here today?
Yeah, because I think it's already a fairly prevalent thing in our culture. It's hard to kind of go through life without encountering it, being offered it, or having friends and family who use it. And so, what are the things that we should be thinking of as Christians and how to analyze this? Not to mention, as you mentioned, on November 3rd, there is, I believe it's going to be New Jersey Public Question 1 on the ballot, recreational use of marijuana in New Jersey. And from what I've seen, there's pretty strong support of it for it. And so it looks like, it will only be growing in prevalence in the coming months and years.
All right, Doug. So with the idea that this might be becoming more and more prevalent, like, how do we look at this as Christians? You know what I mean? Because obviously, well, let's just start there, knowing what marijuana is. I mean, it's hard to not accidentally politicize this conversation, right? Yeah. I'm going to come in here from an absolutely unbiased stance toward one way or another, but with the idea that it's been demonized in some ways and glorified in other ways, with medicinal uses and even recreational uses, and then the threat of it being this drug that will absolutely destroy anybody that comes near to it, or a gateway drug, or everything else. There's a lot of stigma that surrounds marijuana. And so as Christians, I think there's two things that we need to kind of do here. Number one is thread the needle here a little bit on how should we perceive this for what it is, number one. And number two, how do we interpret how God would call us to interact with this?
Right. Yes. And I think there's a couple different perspectives on it, on how we answer, how we're thinking about it. So let's begin by addressing it from a legal standpoint. And by what I mean by that is a Christian's obligation to obey the laws of the land in which he or she lives. Scripture is pretty clear on this. You could probably call this one, but Romans 13 is a well cited passage for the idea that we should be submitted to the governing authorities over us because God has instituted them. And there's obviously a lot more that can be said about that, and that has been said about this. But Christians have a moral obligation before God to abide by the laws of the land in which they live. And that is for a variety of different reasons. One, it is commanded in Scripture. And I think, we could also say when we enjoy the benefits that accrue to us from living in a pretty nice country, living in a pretty nice state, right? We should abide by that. We should abide by their laws. And
Doug, you said Romans 13, right? You're talking probably specifically about verses 1 through 7.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a strong passage for that. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Now, one thing that's sometimes overlooked here, so let's say that marijuana is voted on in come November and is passed, recreational use is passed in New Jersey. I think you still have an issue there because it is still federally illegal. So it may be that the state of New Jersey has legalized it, but it is still federally illegal to possess and use marijuana for at least for recreational use. So we have to take into consideration that, like, if we choose to partake after that, we're still breaking the laws of the land. And so I think that, biblically speaking, there's very good reason for us to continue to abstain, even though it may be legalized on a state level.
Which I still don't obviously this is not a civics, podcast that we're on here, but I still don't understand how that works. How can it be legal at the state level and illegal at the federal level? And like, how do you juxtapose those two things? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, state laws are different than federal laws.
Yeah.
And
it still doesn't make sense that you could have it legal in one and illegal in the other, but that's another conversation.
Yeah. That is a bit of another, but I also want to kind of think about when we're standing in the ballot or ready to do a mail-in ballot or whatever we're going to do, what are some things to consider as to how we vote in one way or another. Now, this is one of those things where maybe frustratingly, I think a case can be made on both sides as to whether to vote to legalize it or not.
Lovely. So we get angry emails from all parties.
Yeah, that's typically how things work when I open up my mouth. So I think we have to ask ourselves, it's okay to vote according to our moral convictions. And if we have strong moral convictions against it, there's nothing unchristian or uncitizenly about doing that. Many laws are based on morality, and I think it's legitimate to do that. We just have to be thinking from both angles. So let me give a little bit of the both angles, the things that kind of play against one another, in my mind at least. So I think we need to ask the general question, is a society better when marijuana use is more prevalent? Because legalization will increase prevalence. And so And do we want to see that happen? Okay, so that's the one side. And one interesting study, for example, was conducted by the NYU School of Medicine, and it examined the states in which it has been legalized. And according to this paper, basically, a summary of it would be that roughly 25% increase occurred in the prevalence of what's considered problematic use in legalized states in age groups 12 to 17 and 26 and older. For reasons we don't have time to get into here.
What happened to 18 and 25?
Bit of an outlier there. Yeah, I think the evidence is less like that there, but nevertheless, that's a minority age group. So in most age groups, problematic use increase. There was about a 25% increase in how much of that they were seeing. And problematic use, but what they mean there is defined by the DSM-4, the diagnostics for psychological disorders and things like that.
Okay.
And that includes things like increased tolerance, repeated attempts to control use or to quit, time spent using, social interpersonal problems due to use, giving up other activities because of use. Those are standard questions that are asked if you're saying, like, am I an alcoholic or something? Okay. So it's that kind of thing. So that's the one side, the consideration that I think we have to keep in mind, is that, are we willing to accept a society in which its usage is more prevalent, where there's more people driving high, there's more people going about their day high, operating machinery and things like that. Okay? And we'll get into some of those things in a little bit as well. The other side of it, the other thing though, that we should consider too, is that we need to ask the question, are anti-marijuana laws unjust or unreasonable? So maybe from the other side, we might say, would society be better if such laws were not in place? So what I'm thinking of are people who get locked up for possession or even use of marijuana, or people who have criminal records because of it. Is this really something that we want to criminalize, and that we want to make people who are otherwise law-abiding citizens, that we want to give them criminal records and perhaps incarcerate them and fine them and arrest them and all the things that come as a result of this being illegal? Is it good that that's in our society? And so I think those are the two things that we need to balance against one another. And I'm not saying it's an easy decision,
right?
But from just a morally serious standpoint, I think those are the things that we need to consider.
Sure.
In how we vote. Now, so getting that out of the way, like, since we've answered that one so definitively, I think we also have to question discernment. And this goes into, like, okay, laws be what they may, they exist, and there are going to be some people who, now obviously, if right now, I think it would be, you could make a very good case that Christians should not do it based on the fact that it is illegal. Okay.
Sure.
So I think it's immoral on those grounds, and Christians should not partake because of that. If you're convinced that federally illegal also would require you to obey the law of the land, and I am, then I think it's continues to be immoral for a Christian, even if it is legalized in New Jersey.
Recreational use?
Yes, recreational use. Yeah,
medicinal use?
kind of, yeah, we want to, if we're convinced that there are medicinal benefits, then that might be, that's kind of a separate thing, so I'm envisioning a situation in which a Christian in good conscience, for some reason, feels like it's okay to disregard federal law, or perhaps a situation in which federal law changes and it's just straight up legal everywhere. How do we think through this? Or how do we think through even like what we think about the issue in terms of whether it should be legalized? There's a few other discernment issues here that I think it'd be good to spend the rest of our time kind of touching on.
Sure. So I know oftentimes when folks visit this issue, right, on either side, whether pro marijuana or anti-marijuana, for legalization, a lot of times it does get compared to alcohol.
Yeah.
And I noticed you had a couple notes on here, as far as like some similarities and some differences. You want to talk about that a little bit, Doug?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a biggie. We live in a country in which I can buy as much booze as I want as long as I'm over 21, and I can consume as much booze as I want, and as long as I'm not like drunk in public. There's usually, or driving or something. There's usually not. I mean, there's problems, but
essentially, you can buy and drink the amount of alcohol that is detrimental to your health, as long as you're essentially not bothering anyone in society.
I could totally destroy my liver.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So there's a little bit of a methodological problem with the comparison that we should be aware of. And that is, just because one thing that is harmful is permitted, that does not mean that another thing that is harmful should be permitted.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So we might say, well, alcohol is bad and it's legal, but that doesn't mean, so why isn't marijuana legal? Like, even if marijuana is less harmful, if it's still harmful, it's hard to see why it follows from the fact that one harmful thing is permitted, that another thing that is harmful, even if it's less harmful, should be permitted.
Right.
So something that,
so, like, to follow along on the same analogy is like, if we were to throw in a different drug, like if I were to pull out marijuana and insert heroin, it's like, oh, well, alcohol could be detrimental to your health and that's legal. So why shouldn't we legalize heroin?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. So
you're not comparing two similar things necessarily.
So there's an apples and oranges issue here.
Right.
But which we'll talk about in a second. But yes, that's exactly, I think the point is that I think if we're going to make an ethical case for the use of marijuana, or at least permitting it, then we have to at least say that it has to stand or fall on its own merits, rather than a comparison with something else that's legal. Because maybe, I'm not going to go into whether alcohol should be legal or not. But So let's talk about a few of the similarities, of course, are that both are intoxicants. Okay, both are going to put you in an altered state of mind. Both have been the subject of prohibition and all the things that come with that, the creation of a black market. Obviously, that was a long time ago with alcohol, but today we still see that illegal activity because of their prohibition. And that I think is a huge thing to consider. When we consider the legalization of drugs, that may be a component in building a just society, is killing the black market for illegal drugs. That is an argument for legalization. So those, I think, are similarities. But when we're comparing things, of course, we don't only have to say in what ways are they similar, we have to say in what ways are they different.
Sure.
That's a key aspect to any comparison. So one, alcohol is more dangerous. It's more dangerous to operate vehicles with. If I'm not going to be as concerned if I know that someone is driving high as if they're driving drunk. Now,
why, Doug?
Okay, so I come at this from a perspective of somebody who was an everyday user for the better part of a decade. I smoked every day. I sold it. I know well the effects of marijuana. And there are even studies that have been done on this. But in general, marijuana makes you kind of paranoid and kind of extra careful. And that doesn't mean that you're as good to drive as if you were sober, but it's not the same as alcohol, where if I have a lot of alcohol, like I'm literally like dizzied, you can't see straight, you can't walk straight. Your judgment is super impaired. Now, having said that, I think we'd also be fools not to acknowledge that there are some extremely potent strains of marijuana out there. And back when I used to use, you could either get dirt or you could get dank. You could get like the stuff that, it's not going to do that much, or you could do something that's going to put you on Mars if you have a couple hits from it, and there is some difference there. So like there is certainly a level of marijuana intoxication where, yeah, you definitely should not be driving. So
essentially what we're saying is, as far as the sake of clarity, I kind of want to draw a difference too, right? You're speaking from experiential wisdom that you have experience. Right. And there are studies as well that support this. And, we should look at the studies. Obviously, you should not be driving intoxicated in any way.
No, you shouldn't.
But if we're going to be comparing marijuana to alcohol, alcohol has a far more dangerous impairment for something like driving.
The impairment is more dangerous. Yes, I think that's a better way to say it. Yeah. Not to mention the fact that you do get angry drunks, right? Whereas you might not get as many angry stoners. Although I will say that like I've been jumped by guys smoking marijuana before. And, there's plenty of crime that takes place under the influence of pot. So, but yeah, the idea of like somebody who smokes and wants to go out and start fights is probably not as common as it is with alcohol. Another aspect of this also is, and I guess this dovetails into the driving thing, is you could be a little bit more objective with alcohol about how much you've had, and you can test for how much you've had. They're ready, right? So I can say, I'm drinking something of this ABV. I've had 2 of them. I'm probably okay to do A, B, or C activity. With pot, it's a lot more ambiguous how much you've taken. And if you're driving, there's as far as I know, there's no like readily available breathalyzer like there is with pot. Like, so a cop can...
You mean vice versa?
Yeah, like, so I know...
Like there is with alcohol, you mean?
Exactly. Yeah, like there is with alcohol. Like if I've been drinking and like there's a credible threat that I could be arrested for doing that, because a cop will have something, if he pulls me over, will have something in his car and he can tell how much I've had. And even if I think I'm good, I might not be good as far as the law is concerned. That threat is not there under marijuana.
Right.
And,
So there's an objective way that we can test whether or not somebody is legitimately coherent enough to drive, right?
yeah.
So you can legitimately get a breathalyzer test and know right then and there how much alcohol is legitimately in your bloodstream and whether or not you should be driving. And there's a clear legal limit there as well. Like if you're above, what is it, 0.08? If you're above,
I don't know the number. Yeah.
I think it's like 0.08 or something.
Mm-hmm.
If you're above that, you should not be driving, period.
Yes.
And honestly, so the cool thing about having that there is there's a clear line because now it's no longer subjective, right?
Yep.
Because if let's say I have a glass of wine, I'm still within a certain time frame, of course, but I'm probably fine to drive. You know what I mean? And a breathalyzer would confirm that. If my wife, who weighs half as much as I did, had that same glass of wine, she probably shouldn't be driving. You know what I mean? And that it's subjective a little bit, you know what I mean? Because everybody
subjective
one drink would be like, oh, I've only had one drink, but there is a test to kind of go to, find that line. With marijuana, like you're saying, there really isn't that way of getting that test unless you go and do like a blood test.
Mm-hmm. Right. So exactly.
How do we define safe and not safe?
How do you define safe and not safe? And how do I define how much I've had?
Sure.
I've different strains are of different strength and different, and then you've got the question of edibles, and you do have, I mean, they are starting to produce things where they'll tell you what the THC content is, but it still is a lot, I think, more ambiguous, like how big are the hits you're taking? Yeah. What is your method of smoking?
And THC is the active,
THC is the active ingredient. Tetrahydrocannabinol delta 9, I think it is.
Okay.
That, if I remember correctly, from 20 years back. Comparisons. So also another thing towards alcohol, though, is alcohol poisoning is possible. Whereas as far as I know, I don't think it's possible to like wind up in the hospital because you've smoked so much weed. Although maybe some people have eaten crazy amounts of edibles or something like that, and it is, but.
So, I mean, that's the other thing too, that's worth at least mentioning here as we record this, right? There is a known threat that if you have too much alcohol, you are damaging your body. You know what I mean? And from what I understand, as far as marijuana use is concerned, let's say recreational smoking of marijuana, to define it, has less of a threat to a medical threat, so to speak, other than the fact that you're inhaling smoke.
Yeah.
Right. Correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, because at least the last that I've heard is that still having THC in the brain is essentially it's not really doing anything negative medically. That was the last I saw.
Physically, we're going to talk in a few minutes about mental impairment.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a lot less physically harmful. The smoke tends to be, and people can vape it and they can eat it. So yeah, I think like the consumption is less physically destructive.
Right. Again, not that we're not making an argument for it or against it. You know what I mean? It's just, it's worth mentioning as we think.
I'd be more concerned for the physical health of someone who's been drinking heavily for 20 years than someone who's been smoking pot every day for 20 years. But the final point of comparison, the point of difference that I think I think is worth touching on as well, is the fact that with alcohol, there is an area of recreational use without intoxication, or I should say without severe intoxication, that marijuana does not seem to have, especially given the fact that most marijuana these days is pretty high quality. So in other words, if we go out to dinner, we can have a drink or two, and you're not at the point of drunkenness.
You're still sober-minded.
Yeah, you're still sober-minded, even if you're starting to feel some of that socially lubricating aspect of alcohol, and you're a little bit more chatty, perhaps.
Sure.
And you're at the point where and I don't have to. Yeah, where it's kind of weird as to whether or not you'd even call it like intoxication. There's
Sure.
there's a fair window there with alcohol. With pot, that window doesn't really exist. With one hit of most marijuana that would be
It's
available
enough.
here, yeah, you're going to be high, and your ability to think is going to be impaired.
Now let me ask you a question, Doug, because I know there's always an argument that frequency of use can build up a
It does,
tolerance
for
to
sure,
marijuana.
without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, I mean, that argument's always there as well, that essentially for those that are smoking more often, let's say even if they're smoking medicinally, you
Mhm.
know what I mean, for certain reasons, that there is a level of tolerance that gets built up over time that could potentially make them more sober-minded.
As I said, I used to smoke every single day, and
Mm-hmm.
I smoked strong weed every single day. And I don't think I was ever at a point where one hit would not get me high.
Okay.
I think tolerance for me looked a lot more like I was able. It may have taken more to get me on the moon, and I may have been able to tolerate and function at higher levels of intoxication. But even smoking every day, like any consumption would do something to me that I would consider intoxication.
Okay.
So like you have to, yeah. And if you're at the point where that doesn't happen, like, Ken, it's a little bit weirder, right? Because think of that social setting, right? If we're sitting there and having a drink, we're sitting there and we're sipping on it for a while, and whereas pot, like, you're going to be like, all right, done. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of there's definitely a difference in comparison there that we need to acknowledge. I think it's not the same thing. Now, the other big thing in terms of discernment, and I think here we get into more explicitly biblical grounds, which is maybe, I think most of what we've already talked about is, you would hear out of any secular discussion on this stuff.
Common knowledge.
Yeah, common knowledge. I think we need to acknowledge that as Christians, we have an obligation to be good stewards of the time and the minds that the Lord has given us. Okay? Now, frequently we find in the New Testament commands or imperatives to be sober-minded. Okay? I think of a passage like 1 Peter 1:13. Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, one thing we do have to acknowledge here is that the term that is usually translated sober-minded, and I'm going by the ESV, does not technically mean not intoxicated with a substance. Like, so sober there does not mean like, you're talking to a recovering alcoholic, how long have you been sober? Which means how long have you not used a drug?
Okay.
Choice. Okay.
Yeah.
So
sober, as far as biblically, means clarity of mind.
Clarity of mind, well balanced. So I'll go by the lexical definition of the dictionary / lexicon that I usually use for this stuff. Well balanced, self-controlled, free from every form of mental and spiritual drunkenness, excess, passion, rashness, or confusion, reasonableness, level-headed, self-controlled. So I think what we want to say is this is a broad term that certainly encompasses chemical intoxication, but is not limited to that. We might also think, for example, of maybe not being easily taken by moral and spiritual fads, right? Maybe being able to think straight and not be subject to the whims of the culture. Things like that also are encompassed by this kind of stuff.
Not being gullible to every wind and every latest article popping up on social media as truth.
Given to emotionalism, all that kind of stuff I think is encompassed. But but the idea here is that, I mean, think of this: prepare your minds for action and be sober-minded. I want to do things in my Christian life that enable me to be there. You know, this is also, by the way, also another biblical command that to keep in mind is like that in the qualifications for overseers that we see in Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3. Not a drunkard is listed at least 3 times in those lists. And
also says sober-minded and self-controlled, which are both definitions.
Yeah, those kinds of things, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But not a drunkard does get explicitly into chemical intoxication. Okay. Now, I don't think that means that you know that you're obligated to never drink anything or to never get into that socially lubricated zone or something like that. But there's a difference between that and intoxication. We're wise enough to see the difference there, and and someone who is a drunkard is not fit to lead the church. And you might say you don't want to read this in an overly restrictive way. You don't want to read it in an overly restrictive way, saying, "Oh, that says drunk. It doesn't say anything about pot," right? No, I think that's a little bit too literalistic of a reading of that.
Sure.
I think it's reasonable to include other forms of intoxication. And also, you don't want to be over-restricted B in the sense of saying, oh, that only applies to overseers. It doesn't apply to if I don't hold some kind of church office, this isn't an ethical guidance for me, because truth be told, and I say this often when I teach on these qualifications, is that all an overseer really is, in terms of qualifications, is an exemplary Christian. Right. All the things that are in those lists are things that are required pretty much of all Christians.
Right.
It's just that an overseer is exemplary.
It's essentially saying, like, if we're going to look to an example somewhere within the church and we're looking to somebody like this, these are minimum requirements because this is what every Christian should attain to.
Right. Exactly. So I think we have to be acknowledged, in light of these things, in light of the idea that we should not be drunkards, and in light of the fact that we need to be sober-minded with our minds prepared for action, we need to realize the fact that marijuana does dull the mind. I know that there are some people who claim that they can be very productive on it, that they can buckle down and do stuff, but I can't really say that it's hard for me to hear that with a straight face, just with the experience that I've had. I have had friends like that and still do have friends that claim to be like that. And I'm not going to say they're liars or anything like that. But at the very least, even if you want to grant that there are some people who can be very functional when they're high, the vast majority of people who use do not. And I know that is not me. I remember, when I smoke, and even when I've smoked, that even not been able to think through things like I know I can when I'm sober, and even like I can even remember, like, if it had been a couple days since I smoked, or maybe I hadn't smoked that day, like having a hard time just thinking about stuff and being like, am I this dumb, or is this the pot?
Yeah.
Am I still just in some kind of brain fog? Like that's especially given the challenges in our culture today. Like, we are experiencing this seismic shift, I think, in the church's role in the world, and or maybe I should say the world is experiencing a seismic shift, that the church, as this beacon of truth, this city on a hill, has to adapt itself to and be able to answer in ways that are biblically informed and gospel-centric, right? And in order to do that, we need thinkers. We need, even if you don't consider yourself to be like a Christian intellectual or something like that, like, this is not the time to cash out with our brains. This is the time to fully engage and have minds that are prepared to think, and to think hard. Now, I have no doubt that you can sit there high with your friends and talk all have all these deep conversations and things like that. And to some extent, marijuana does facilitate that kind of thinking. But that kind of thinking is much more of a low resolution than we want to think. Yeah. You know, like I want my thoughts about something deep to be more than, wow, that's crazy. You know, like I want to be able to actually analyze arguments. I want to be actually be able to discern the will of God.
Right. To comment into and speak on opposing views and various factors, like just like a conversation we're having now. And I just want to clarify something a little earlier too that you said, Doug, because you said that, you know, this seismic shift that's happening in the world, you said the church needs to adapt. And what you mean by that is that we need to engage with what's going on in every sense around us, right? You're not arguing that somehow we should start bending biblical truth in order to somehow better please the culture.
We are missionaries.
Right.
And a missionary has to know the culture that they're called to reach. And that culture has shifted some ground underneath our feet, and it has in recent years. And this is fueled by a bunch of different things. I feel strongly that it is very much so through social media and things like that, and through social discourse. But even if you think about just like the culture's perception of Christianity, right? Like I often say that in past years, the big question people asked of Christianity was, is it true? Today, the question tends to be, is it moral? Right? Everything is moralized. Like that is a cultural shift, and we have to be able to engage that. And so we need our thinkers on board. We need all hands on deck. We need people who could do more than just sit and consume media and consume things like that. We need people who can actually engage.
Right.
And like I think if you doubt this, right, try smoking weed and reading a book. And I'm not saying like read, I don't know, Twilight or something like that. I'm saying like read a book that's actually like thoughtful. Okay. Like you're not going to be able to absorb that like you will when you're sober.
And when you say try smoking pot and reading a book, you don't literally mean go smoke a joint and read a book.
Well, I mean, I'm saying
you're giving an example.
Maybe somebody who already, who feels like they can handle this. And
so if you're convinced against it.
Yeah, I'm not like recommending go out there. I love how there's been like at least 3 times on this so far that you've been like, Doug, what you mean by this is
because Doug, I know the emails that are going to come, and I know the text messages that.
Yeah, so I'm not saying this. But
Doug said that we have to go smoke pot and read books and adapt to culture so that the church is more relevant.
No,
that's the email I'm going to get.
No, what I'm saying is see what happens. See how well you absorb quality information and are able to process it with a mind that's dulled by the use of marijuana.
Right.
The final thing that I kind of want to just run through here is a while back. So these are my general thoughts, and I think I've already given that, and I think that probably the strongest thing in my mind is that like I don't have enough time and bandwidth in my life to have these like several hour sessions of just putting my mind in the cloud, like keep this world, my church, my family, and the same goes not just because I'm a pastor, but everybody that I'm speaking to, right? They need you to be present. The Lord needs you to be mentally present where you are. And doing things to take you out of that. Like the Lord gave you your brain and it works just the way he wants it to work. So like, it's as if the Lord gave you a knife, right? And you're like, well, you know what I'm going to do with this knife? I'm going to dull it. I'm going to hit it against this metal, right? No, like he gave you that blade and it's sharp and he wants you to use it sharp. He doesn't want you to do things to purposely dull it. So
it kind of reminds me of the parable of the talents a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yes.
If we have a certain amount of talent that God's given us, right? Whatever that might be, skill set or finances or whatever you want to call that. If we're just burying all that in the ground and just
exactly
smoking it away, you know what I mean? At the end of your life, like time is a finite resource. You know what I mean? There's only so much of it that we have, at least on this side of heaven, And so what are you doing with your life how are you using that to forward the kingdom, to bear fruit for the kingdom, to glorify God, oh Christian? And if you're just smoking all of that away, is that the biblical call that you have? Is that what Jesus is really calling us to?
Even if it's my downtime or my Sabbath or something like that, I want to be able to, process the things that I'm taking in a sober-minded way.
Yeah. All of life is worship, in how we work, in how we rest. And so the question is, like, am I worshiping God in this?
Yeah. I want to close with reading something that I compiled a while back on alcohol use. And I think a lot of it applies to marijuana use, because so the angle I'm coming from here too is that there's a remaining biblical angle that needs to be acknowledged here, and that is kind of like a Romans 14 kind of thing, where you have moral disagreements among Christians in terms of like what activities you're going to engage in. For the early churches was things like eating meat that's sacrificed to idols, and also drinking was part of this, observance of Sabbath days and things like that. Now, I'm not saying this is not the only calculation to go in. I want everybody to keep in mind the legal stuff we've talked about, the sober-mindedness stuff we've talked about, even the comparison with alcohol type stuff we've talked about. But this is simply another layer on top of those things, okay? So in no way am I saying that marijuana is a morally neutral issue and we should just treat it as if it's like, should I don't know, wear expensive shoes or not, or I don't know. Like, so there are those more questions, but here's something that I compiled in terms of what I gleaned to be the application for drinking from Romans 14, which is where Paul discusses this matter. He also discusses this in 1 Corinthians, like chapters 9 and 10 especially. But these are some applicational guidelines that kind of guide Christian alcohol consumption. And I think they can guide the way that we should be thinking of marijuana as well. I think they're helpful for that. So I'm just gonna go ahead.
Read it.
All right. If I have a problem with alcohol use, I should abstain. Okay. So if and by a problem with it, I mean anything from if I'm prone to drunkenness or if I think it's wrong. Okay. But specifically given to habitual use and doing destructive things. If I have a problem, I should abstain. 2, if I'm with someone who has a problem with alcohol use, I should abstain.
That's pretty clear biblically.
Yeah. Number 3, if I'm with someone who thinks alcohol consumption is wrong, I should abstain. Okay? Number 4, if I think alcohol consumption is wrong, I should abstain. So that would essentially be like anybody who's convinced of anything else we've said on this session here, that's applicable to you. If you think it's wrong, you should abstain.
Right.
Number 5, if I'm with someone who thinks I think consumption is wrong, I should abstain. Okay, so that's a little bit deeper of a thing. But let's say I'm thinking about having a drink with my friend at the bar, and my friend knows I'm a Christian, and he thinks that all Christians think it's wrong. And so if I get a drink, he thinks that I'm sinning. He thinks that I'm going against my conscience.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think that's another dimension there, okay?
That's a longer conversation.
Number 6, okay? If I partake, it should only be done in moderation and not to the point of intoxication. Again, we've already covered that with marijuana. I think
also clear in Scripture.
Yeah, clear in Scripture. Number 7, if I partake, it should only be done in accordance with the law. Again, something we've also covered here. Number 8, if I partake, I should not advertise it.
And important for our culture.
Yeah, exactly. And number 9, alcohol should not be consumed at official church gatherings. So if I'm having a small group, I'm not busting out this fruity new IPA that I found, especially since I'm keto. So that would.
So why is that, Doug? Because of everything that came before it?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, I think it's unwise in general. I know there are some churches who do, will have fellowship meals and bust out the wine and stuff, but yeah, there are going to be people there who may have problems with it. There are going to be people there who think it's wrong, or there's a very good chance there will be. There may be people there who think it's wrong. Yeah, I mean, a lot of those things, and so it's unwise to have it there. It's unwise to normalize this ethically, this thing with so many ethical issues. It's like, why bring that into a church? I think Paul's words are wise where he says, the kingdom of heaven is not about eating and drinking, but of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. So let's not live our lives in such a way in which this conversation is just going to dominate, right? Because my fellowship with this person is no longer about, talking about things that edify and spiritually build up, but now it's about, whether or not we should be drinking or whether or not we should be smoking pot.
Right.
And all the issues that come, like, do we really need that to drag that into the church? So, even if in my conscience, for some reason, I'm convinced that I can do something, your brothers and sisters in Christ are not there. And frankly, there are more important things to give our time to and to give our attention to, namely righteousness, peace, and joy in the Spirit.
I think it's a solid point, honestly. That last one was interesting to me. But I've been in a situation like that before in our own small group where nobody in the group struggled with alcohol use. And so together we were just like, hey, do we want to have some wine? We had some wine. And then a buddy of mine approached me afterwards. He's just like, well, it made me a little uncomfortable. And I said, I apologize. And I said, how come? Help me understand. He's like, well, I've got other friends that are not Christians that if they were to come here or ask what we do together as a small group, it's like we sit down and we drink. It's like, how's that different from anything else that we do together? And like, it's interesting because, I hadn't thought about it from that perspective before, because for the group that I was in at the time, a few years ago, all mature Christians that, none of whom were struggling with alcohol in any sense. And even this friend of mine that approached me, like we've had drinks together before. But the thought of that if he's going to invite, because the point is to be missionary with our community, right? And he wants to invite friends out. And if their perspective is a weakness for them, or at least a stumbling block between them and Jesus or, the gospel, well, then why would we not give up that right? We don't need this,
Exactly.
And it was interesting. And I remember learning that well in that short instance.
It's the other issue to keep in mind too, is that it's alcoholism hides itself. And just because I don't think someone has a problem with it, and just because they're telling me they don't have a problem with it, that's not proof positive that they don't. And so, like, if I were in a group with people, and like, it's not safe to assume all the time that everyone that you're drinking with is handling it the way they should. And I know that complicates like a lot of social interaction.
No, it's true though, because
you need to be aware of that, like, what an alcoholic would tell you if you're offering them a drink? I'm not an alcoholic and I don't have a problem with this.
Yeah. Fair enough.
So
awesome. Doug, thank you. Thanks for your time today. Thanks everybody for tuning in with us. I know this is not a clear-cut issue. And so obviously, we said this a little bit earlier, we're not trying to persuade anyone to vote this way or that way, but at least as Christians, as we operate well, the questions that we're always trying to answer, number one is what's biblical, right? What's God honoring? And then also what's discerning, for us as we navigate together. What we shoot for together as Christians is not to have the most sound argument for an issue. The thing that we're aiming for together as Christians is how do we bear fruit for the kingdom of God? How do we worship Jesus through this? And how do we help call others to the mission as well, into life-saving relationship with Jesus? So thank you guys for joining in today. Doug, thanks for your time, brother. Nice. Go ahead, play it. There's our outro. See you guys next time. See you later.